The early modern period was a turning point for European countries. In the history of England, this era began with the rise of a new royal dynasty, the Tudors. England started transforming from a simple feudal kingdom into one of the most powerful European nations. The reigns of both ruthless and benevolent monarchs of this Welsh dynasty were inevitably accompanied by political intrigues, leading to unexpected twists in history. The Tudors trace their origins to the Welsh knight Henry VIII. The descendants of this knight were called the Tudors of Penmynydd, named after the settlement from which Henry hailed. They faithfully served the Welsh kings of Gwynedd and frequently fought against the English. Nevertheless, after Wales was conquered by the English in 1282, like most of the Welsh nobility, they began serving the English kings. The Tudors of Penmynydd fought against the Scots of Robert the Bruce, and also took part in English campaigns in France during the 100 Years' War. During the 100 Years' War, a prolonged uprising led by Owain Glyndwr broke out in Wales, but the English eventually crushed it. The Tudors of Penmynydd also took part in this rebellion, and all three of them perished in the struggle. The son of one of them, Owain ap Meredydd, lost his family lands and went to England in search of a better future. There, he replaced his cumbersome Welsh name with one more familiar to the English, becoming Owen Tudor, a squire to King Henry V. After the king's death, Owen married his widow, Catherine of Valois, and they had two children, Edmund and Jasper Tudor. They became influential figures at the court of their half-brother, Henry VI. Additionally, Edmund Tudor married Margaret Beaufort, the only daughter of the Duke of Somerset, which brought him considerable wealth. When you dive into the history of royal families like the Tudors, you can't help but wonder what stories are hidden in your own family's past. That's exactly what got me to try MyHeritage, the sponsor of this video. MyHeritage is a leading platform for exploring your family history. It gives you access to over 33 billion historical records, helps you build a family tree, find documents, enhance and even animate old photos, all in just a few clicks. When I started using MyHeritage, I entered all the relatives we knew, based on family records going back to 1860. That helped me build a direct ancestral line across 5 generations. I also knew that my great-great-great-grandfather, Isaac Braverman, had a brother. According to family stories, they lost contact around 1890. So I was genuinely surprised when I found his name in a 1917 ship passenger list on MyHeritage. He was traveling to Boston with his wife, and most unexpectedly, with a son we never even knew existed. That discovery reconnected a lost branch of our family after more than 100 years of silence. What impressed me the most was the photo feature. Old pictures come back to life, sharper, in color, and even animated. Sometimes it really feels like someone from the past is looking right at you. MyHeritage offers a 14-day free trial. Just click the link in the description or scan the QR code on your screen to get started. With just a few clicks, you can uncover information about your ancestors, discover historical records, and bring old photos back to life. When the War of the Roses began, the Tudors supported the royal house of Lancaster. Nonetheless, the war shattered the family. Owen and Edmund were killed. Jasper and his young nephew Henry fled to France, while the widowed Margaret Beaufort remained to govern the inherited lands. She possessed remarkable political acumen and, along with her son, was the closest surviving representative of the now destroyed Lancastrian dynasty. Thanks to the efforts of Margaret Beaufort and her allies, such as her new husband, Earl Thomas Stanley, Lancastrian supporters began rallying around the young Henry Tudor, who eventually launched a campaign against the Yorkists from Brittany. In 1485, Henry Tudor arrived in England and defeated the forces of Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Richard was killed in battle, and the crown of England fell into the hands of Henry Tudor. Winning the crown was not enough. Henry VII now had to keep it. England was severely weakened after 30 years of bloody war. The royal treasury was empty, and Henry VII inherited the debts of his predecessors. All of this had completely undermined the authority of the monarchy, and the fact that Henry had seized power by force cast doubt on his legitimacy. Already at the beginning of his reign, several attempts were made to overthrow the Tudors. The most notable of these was led by Perkin Warbeck, a pretender who claimed to be Prince Richard of York, the son of Edward IV. At first, he received support from the French, which nearly led to war between France and England in 1492. Subsequently, when the French king Charles VIII expelled Perkin, he traveled to Ireland, where he gathered Yorkist supporters to fight against the Tudors, though without success. He then moved to Scotland, where he received assistance from the local king. In 1496, he invaded England alongside the Scots, but got bogged down in sieges of border castles. When English forces arrived, James IV made peace with them, and Perkin fled to Ireland once again. A year later, a rebellion broke out in Cornwall, and Perkin attempted to take advantage of it. Even so, he landed in England only after the Cornish rebels had already been defeated, and his attempt to capture Exeter failed. This time, the English captured Perkin and imprisoned him in the Tower of London. A few years later, he attempted to escape, but was caught and executed. All these events demonstrated to Henry VII the necessity of strengthening his rule. In foreign policy, he turned to marital diplomacy. He married his eldest son, Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the Catholic monarchs of Spain. Meanwhile, his daughter Margaret was wed to the Scottish king James IV. Through these alliances, the English king elevated his dynasty to the status of other European royal families. In domestic policy, Henry VII focused on strengthening royal authority. After the Wars of the Roses, the English nobility was already weakened. The Livery Act effectively banned feudal lords from maintaining private armies, making them entirely dependent on the king. To reduce the influence of powerful noble families, Henry VII began appointing minor gentry or even commoners to key positions. Financial matters were no less important for the Tudors. The king centralized the tax collection system and made it more regular. Tax collectors became more stringent. This situation is best illustrated by the stance of Bishop John Morton, who served as the king's chancellor during those years. He believed that those who lived lavishly should pay taxes because they clearly had money to spend. Likewise, those who lived modestly should also pay taxes since they had obviously saved money by living frugally. Henry VII also used other methods to secure finances. In 1490, he twice raised money from Parliament for a war with France, and later he took money from the French, who paid him to maintain peace. Despite this, Henry Tudor cannot be called greedy, as, for example, it was under him that the Richmond Palace was built, which became the new residence for English kings. Overall, this financial policy of the Tudor allowed him not only to pay off all debts, but also to fill the royal treasury. By 1509, when Henry VII died, his treasury held £15 million, equivalent to 10 years' worth of royal revenue. It so happened that Arthur Tudor died in his youth, so the new king became Henry VII's second son, also named Henry. His father had planned a church career for him, and thus the young prince spent his early years studying theology. Nevertheless, when the young prince entered the royal court, he became captivated by all the pleasures of court life: feasts, hunting, tournaments, and lovers. Practically all of his reign was spent indulging in these activities. He became so enamored with knightly tournaments that in 1536, he nearly died in one of them. While the king was busy with pleasures, the kingdom was ruled by officials on his behalf. Yet, Henry VIII cannot be called a ruler who shunned politics. His favorite method was to delegate all unpopular decisions to his officials, while only the popular ones remained his responsibility. This way, a public perception of a good king developed, with all successes being attributed to him, while all failures and problems were blamed on the bad nobles who surrounded the king. When officials became extremely unpopular, Henry VIII would theatrically put them on trial and execute them, thus gaining even greater popularity. This happened with Cardinal Thomas Wolsey and Chancellor Thomas Cromwell. But Henry VIII is most famous in history for his 6 marriages. The English even have a tongue twister about it. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, he inherited from his brother in order to preserve the Anglo-Spanish alliance. Catherine was older than her husband, but she had a good education, knew several languages, and showed a talent for politics. Her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, even appointed her as an official ambassador to England. When Henry VIII went to war with France in 1513, the King of Scotland, James IV, attacked England as an ally of the French. Catherine personally led the troops north. Her presence boosted the morale of the English, and in the Battle of Flodden, they defeated the Scots, and King James IV was killed in battle. Even so, the marriage to Catherine had a problem. Of all her children, only their daughter Mary survived. Henry VIII wanted a male heir. He even had an illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, with one of his mistresses, and the king granted him a title of duke, but he was not considered a legitimate heir to the throne. Catherine was 40 years old when Henry began his quest. Specifically, he began courting Anne Boleyn. Anne didn't want to be just the king's mistress. She demanded marriage. Then, Henry VIII requested permission from the Pope to divorce Catherine. Still, the Pope refused to annul the marriage, as the Italian wars were in full swing at the time, and it was politically disadvantageous for him to grant such a request. But Henry VIII was determined to get his way, so he broke with the Catholic Church. Initially, he declared the Church of England independent from the Pope, making himself as king the new head of the Church. This allowed him to annul his marriage to Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn. As a result, England became a Protestant country, establishing the Church of England, which, though, was still quite similar to Catholicism in many ways. Over time, more radical forms of Protestantism, such as Presbyterianism, Quakerism, Puritanism, and others, began to spread among the common English people. Henry VIII did not forget about the church's wealth either. By that time, the church, particularly monasteries, owned a quarter of the arable land in the kingdom. Therefore, in 1536, the king began seizing these lands and closing monasteries. In total, nearly 400 monasteries were shut down. Their funds and treasures, even from tombs, were appropriated to the royal treasury, and the confiscated lands were sold off. In this new marriage, Henry also had a daughter, Elizabeth. It should be noted that Anne Boleyn was not popular at the king's court. She tried to promote her supporters to high positions and interfered in politics, which led to conflicts with nearly all the nobles. Soon, she also had conflicts with the king himself. Henry VIII did not break the tradition of having mistresses, and Anne became jealous. Eventually, Henry simply accused her of adultery, witchcraft, and many other crimes, and ordered her execution. After Anne's execution, Henry VIII married Jane Seymour, another of his mistresses. In this marriage, Henry finally had a son, Edward, but Jane died from complications during childbirth. In his fourth marriage, Henry married Anne of Cleves from a small German duchy in 1539. Anne of Cleves is most famous in history for the portrait of her that made her appear more attractive than she actually was. The king and the duchess married by proxy, but when Anne arrived in England, her appearance disappointed Henry, and he immediately sought an annulment. Despite this, Henry and Anne maintained a friendly relationship. They corresponded, exchanged gifts, and Henry even allowed Anne to retain the title of queen. In the same year, Henry VIII married Catherine Howard, who was Anne Boleyn's cousin. This marriage proved problematic from the start, as both Henry and Catherine were unfaithful to each other. When it was revealed that Catherine had committed adultery, she was executed. Henry's sixth and final wife was Catherine Parr, who was also the guardian of his daughter Elizabeth. Catherine survived her husband, but only for a short time, as Henry passed away in 1547. Henry VIII also tried to gain military glory. From his youth, through his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, he participated in the Italian wars, fighting as an ally of Spain against France. Henry did not stop fighting even after his divorce with Catherine, as capturing French cities still seemed like a profitable endeavor. In 1544, the English captured Boulogne. All the same, when it became clear that the costs of holding this city outweighed the potential gains, they sold it back to the French. Henry VIII achieved success in the conquest of Ireland. In the early 16th century, the situation in Ireland was complex. Some lands were held by local Irish clans, while others were controlled by English lords. These factions constantly fought each other or formed alliances, acknowledging the English king's sovereignty but often only on paper. At the same time, Ireland was officially considered the possession of the Pope. Among the English lords in Ireland, the Fitzgerald family owned the most land. The head of this family was executed by Henry VIII. And when his son, Thomas Fitzgerald, learned of this the same year, he declared himself ruler of all Ireland and refused to submit to the English king. These events are known in history as the Kildare Rebellion, named after the county long held by the Fitzgeralds. Initially, the rebellion was successful. Thomas captured significant lands, but he was unable to seize Dublin. The following year, when English forces landed on the island, Thomas, after several defeats, surrendered to the English. He was sent to London, imprisoned in the Tower, and executed 2 years later. Meanwhile, English forces subdued most of Ireland's lands. In 1542, Henry VIII declared himself King of Ireland, thereby officially annexing the island to English rule. Towards the end of his reign, Henry also intervened in the war with Scotland. At that time, the Scottish King James V had just died, and the throne was inherited by his newborn daughter, Mary Stuart. Henry VIII decided to marry his son Edward to Mary in order to strengthen his position in Scotland. To force the Scots to agree to such a marriage, he had to start a war with Scotland. This war later became known in history as the Rough Wooing. Despite the English victory at the Battle of Pinkie, the Scots showed heroic resistance. France sided with the Scots and declared war. Mary Stuart was sent to Paris. All of this made the war with Scotland extremely difficult, and it no longer brought any benefits. Ultimately, Henry VIII died in 1547, and his son, Edward VI, inherited the throne. Since Edward was underage, a regency council ruled in his place. Initially, the council was led by the king's uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset. Nevertheless, due to intrigues, he lost power, and then the council was headed by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. As the Scots achieved several victories in the war, Dudley signed a peace treaty with Scotland. For a long time, it was believed that Edward was sickly and weak-willed, and that he would have made a poor king. This is often associated with two major uprisings that broke out during his reign. In the south, in 1549, the Cornish rose up because they disliked the imposition of the English language in church services, as they preferred to pray in their native Cornish language. The second uprising occurred in the same year, but in the east, led by Robert Kett. This was a peasant rebellion over land disputes with the feudal lords. Both uprisings were brutally suppressed. Even so, recent research proves that Edward was a talented student. He knew several foreign languages, studied geography with great enthusiasm, and showed the qualities of a good ruler. But at the beginning of 1553, Edward VI fell ill, and modern scholars believe he suffered from tuberculosis. After 6 months, the young king passed away. He bequeathed his crown to his second cousin, Lady Jane Grey, who was also the daughter-in-law of John Dudley. With Jane's help, John hoped to maintain his power. But just 9 days later, supporters of Mary Tudor, the first daughter of King Henry VIII, took control of London. Jane Grey and John Dudley were imprisoned in the Tower of London and soon executed. Mary I became queen. Mary Tudor was a devout Catholic. To strengthen the position of Catholics in England, she married Prince Philip of Habsburg, the future King Philip II of Spain. This marriage sparked a rebellion in Kent, led by Thomas Wyatt, as some English people, while accepting a Catholic queen, did not want a foreign king. All the same, in the Battle of Charing Cross, Wyatt was defeated, and Mary continued her reign. She attempted to restore Catholicism in England, but her chosen method was terror. Mary began persecuting Protestants, burning them as heretics. In total, over 200 prominent Protestants were burned. Such actions did not increase Mary's popularity, leading the people to call her Bloody Mary. When Mary, through her marriage, drew England into Spain's war with France, the French were able to capture the city of Calais, the last English stronghold on the continent, a remnant from the 100 Years' War. That same year, Mary Tudor passed away, and her half-sister Elizabeth I became the new queen. Elizabeth showed a passion for learning from a young age. She knew 5 foreign languages, and when she became queen, she learned Welsh, Cornish, and Irish to speak all the languages of her subjects. When Elizabeth inherited the power, England was already a centralized state, and therefore she could focus on foreign policy. Since Europe was swept by religious conflicts at that time, Elizabeth found allies among the Protestants. For example, in France, where there was a war between the Huguenot Protestants and Catholics, the English, supporting the former, captured 2 French cities in 1562 with plans to later exchange them for Calais. But this only united the Protestants and Catholics of France. The French, with joint efforts, drove the English out of Normandy. After that, Elizabeth refrained from direct military intervention. Instead, she preferred diplomacy with all countries except Spain. Spain at that time was extremely powerful, and its strength was backed by a formidable fleet. Since the English fleet could not openly confront the Spanish, Elizabeth allowed English pirates to raid Spanish ships, which not only weakened the Spanish, but also brought significant profits. It was during these years that the famous pirate Francis Drake became renowned. The conflict with Spain escalated further when, in 1585, the English intervened in the war in the Netherlands. The local Protestants had just rebelled against Spanish rule. Although the English forces did not bring the Dutch an ultimate victory, it was an unpleasant development for the Spanish. As a result, they began preparing an expedition to the British Isles to conquer England. This expedition, which set off in 1588, involved over 130 ships, 8,000 sailors, and nearly 20,000 soldiers, with an additional similar number of soldiers expected to join in the Netherlands. But when the Invincible Armada encountered the English fleet, it suffered several small but significant defeats. While English ships were sinking Spanish vessels in the Channel, troops were gathering in Essex to defend against the Spanish invasion of the island. Queen Elizabeth personally arrived to speak to the soldiers and address the army, inspiring them to victory. This was called the Speech at Tilbury. Even so, the English did not have to fight the Spaniards on land. Initially, the Spanish fleet suffered a defeat at Gravelines, and then it encountered a storm in the North Sea. The English defeated the most powerful maritime nation of the time. The English expedition to Spain, which took place the following year, ended in failure and is often forgotten. In domestic politics, Elizabeth tried to maintain a balance between her Protestant and Catholic subjects. This was not always successful. The most controversial issue was the fate of Mary Stuart. The former Queen of Scotland had lost power in 1567 and soon fled to England. Elizabeth faced a dilemma. Mary had familial ties to the Tudors, was a Catholic, and some Catholic English nobles wished to see her as the Queen of England. It is unclear whether Mary herself wanted to claim the English throne, but she was imprisoned in the Tower several times before being executed in 1587. To avoid problems with Scotland, Elizabeth even promised the Scottish king that he would be her successor. James VI agreed to trade his mother for the English crown. Much more serious problems for Elizabeth were caused by the Irish. They did not accept the idea of Protestantism, mostly remaining Catholic, which only deepened the conflicts with the English authorities on the island. The family of the Earls of Desmond raised rebellions against the English twice. The most successful for the Irish was Tyrone's Rebellion, which began in 1593, also known as the 9 Years' War. Then, several Irish clans united for a joint struggle against the English. They defeated the English forces on the island and took control of most of the Irish lands. And when new English forces arrived in 1599, the Irish defeated them as well. For these defeats, Elizabeth even imprisoned her commander, Robert Devereux, who was later executed. Still, soon old conflicts between the Irish clans resumed, and by 1603, the English forces had separately defeated all the Irish rebels. For ordinary English people during Elizabeth's reign, the biggest problem was the plague epidemic of 1592, which lasted for 2 years. The hardest-hit area was London. Almost 20,000 people died in the city and its surroundings. Despite everything, for the English, Elizabeth's reign was relatively peaceful. The economy, trade, and culture were flourishing. It was during these years that English theater thrived, and it was then that famous English playwrights, including the most influential William Shakespeare, created their works. It was also during this time that the English established their first colony in America on the island of Roanoke. This colony is most famous for the fact that it was found deserted 2 years later. Historians still do not know where its inhabitants went, and only various hypotheses exist. In 1600, the British East India Company was established to promote trade. It was essentially a trade union that included nearly 300 English merchants. The company was granted a monopoly on maritime trade, from which it became wealthy and brought significant revenue to the royal treasury. Equally intriguing was the Queen's personal life. As a princess, Elizabeth met Robert Dudley, and for a long time he was her favorite. Elizabeth even had plans to marry him, but she was advised against it by royal counselors, considering that Dudley was not popular among the common people. Interestingly, in 1587, an Englishman named Arthur Dudley was arrested in Spain, claiming to be the illegitimate son of Queen Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley. Nonetheless, the Spaniards did not believe this, and soon Arthur Dudley disappeared from the pages of history. Many European monarchs sought the hand of Elizabeth I. Among them were Philip II, King of Spain, Frederick II, King of Denmark, and even the ruler of the distant Grand Principality of Moscow, Ivan the Terrible. The Queen turned them all down. For this reason, she was called the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth herself humorously responded that she was married to the English people. When good Queen Bess, as she was called by the English, passed away in 1603, the English crown was inherited by the Scottish King James VI Stuart, who became James I in England. Thus ended the short era of the Tudors, and with it, the English Renaissance period. The Tudors inherited England as a typical feudal kingdom, and left behind a powerful centralized monarchy with a strong navy and claims to primacy among European states. Don't forget, your family's story might be closer than you think. Try MyHeritage today. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code on the screen.